Full text of Zhang Ailing's Red Roses and White Roses P1. Maybe every man has had two women like this, at least two. Marry a red rose, and over time, the red one will become a smear of mosquito blood on the wall, while the white one will remain the bright moonlight in front of the bed. Marry a white rose, and the white one will become a grain of rice sticky on the clothes, but the red one will it's a cinnabar mole on the heart. Section 1. There are two women in Zhang Bao's life. He said that one is his white rose, and the other is his red rose. One is a holy wife, the other is a passionate mistress. This is how ordinary people always talk about the two words chaste and strong separately. Maybe every man has had two women like this, at least two. Marry a red rose, and over time, the red one will become a smear of mosquito blood on the wall, while the white one will remain the bright moonlight in front of the bed. Marry a white rose, and the white one will become a grain of rice sticky on the clothes, but the red one will become a cinnabar mole on the heart. This is not the case in Zhang Bao. He has a beginning and an end, and is methodical. He is the most ideal modern Chinese character, even if the things he encounters are not entirely ideal. If you ask him from the heart, talk to the heart, and adjust it after a few moments, it will be better. It becomes as if it is idealized, and everything is in its proper place. He came from a decent background, went abroad to get a degree, and interned in a factory. Not only was he truly talented and learned, but he also made his fortune by working part-time while studying. He reached a very high position in an old foreign dyeing and weaving company. His wife is a college graduate with a clean family background, good looks, and a gentle personality. She never goes out to socialize. One daughter is only 9 years old, and her college education expenses have already been prepared. No one is as considerate as him in serving his mother. No one is as careful as he is in promoting his brothers. No one is as enthusiastic and conscientious as him in office work. No one is as enthusiastic, loyal and self-denying as he is in treating friends. He is very enthusiastic about his life. He does not believe in the afterlife. Otherwise he would have to go through it all over again under a different name. Although the generally wealthy and idle literary and artistic young people laugh at him, they do not dislike him because of his tackiness is a foreign kind of tackiness. He is not tall, but he is agile. He has a dull yellow face and wears black-rimmed glasses, and the details of his facial features are unclear, but his appearance was solemn. When he spoke, if it wasn't a joke, he was also categorical. It was extremely refreshing, as if he could be seen clearly at a glance. Even if he didn't see that his eyes were sincere, even his glasses could be used as a token. Zhang Bao came from a humble background. If he had not fought for his own freedom, he might have had to study business and work as a shop assistant, living and dying in an ignorant small circle all his life. As it stands now, when he came back from abroad to work, he was standing at the window of the world. It is really rare for a free person. No matter in terms of environment or thought, the life of an ordinary person is still a peach blossom fan no matter how good it is. His head was broken, and blood spattered on the fan, which was slightly dyed and turned into a peach blossom. However, Zhang Bao's fan was still blank. His pen was full of ink, and the windows were bright and clean, just waiting for him to finish writing. There is also a faint shadow of a person on the blank page, like a kind of exquisite antique letterhead, with slightly concave pink and purple portraits in ancient costumes, printed on the white paper. Before the wife and mistress, there are two other women. The first was a prostitute in Paris. Zhang Bao studied textile engineering and entered school in Edinburgh. Poor students can't see much in foreign countries. The UK in Zhang Bao's memories is limited to underground trams, boiled cabbage, blank fog, hunger, and greed. For things like opera, he only met the Russian opera troupe in Shanghai after returning to China. Only during the summer vacation of 1 year, he spent a little more money and took some time to travel to the European continent. When he passed through Paris, he didn't want to see how bad the people in Paris were. But without a friend and leader who had the inside story, such a friend he can't afford to make friends. And I don't want to make friends. I've gone out on my own, but I'm afraid of being bullied and spending more than I budget. In the evening of this day in Paris, he had nothing to do, so he had dinner early. His apartment was on a secluded street. He walked home, thinking to himself, "People think I have been to Paris." He felt a little sad. The street lights were already on, but the sun was still overhead. It dropped bit by bit, falling onto the roof of the square cement building. It dropped further and dropped further, until the roof seemed to be eroded white. Peace. Along the way, Zhang Bao felt desolate. Someone in someone's house was playing the piano with one finger, pressing down each word slowly, and playing the tunes of Christmas hymns, one after another. Christmas poems on Christmas Eve have their own joyful atmosphere, but in this summer afternoon, on the quiet long street bathed in the sun, it is so inappropriate. Just like a dream, boring and ridiculous. Zhang Bao didn't know why, but he couldn't bear to play the piano with one finger. He stepped forward and walked forward, one hand in his trouser pocket, the palm of which was sweating. He walked faster, but a woman in black in front slowed down and turned her head slightly to glance at him. She wore a red petticoat under a black silk gauze. He likes red underwear. I didn't expect that there were women like this in a place like this. And there was also a small hotel. Many years later, when Zhang Bao recounted this incident to his friends, he always joked with himself with a sense of joyful sadness, saying, "I was still a boy before I went to Paris. I should pay my respects. In retrospect, it must have been very romantic." It happened, but for some reason, he couldn't remember the romantic part, and only chose the annoying part to remember. Foreigners tend to smell more smelly than Chinese people, and this woman was always worried. He saw her raise her arm intentionally or unintentionally, and turned her head to smell it. Perfume was sprayed on the clothes and in the armpits. The cheap perfume mixed with the body odor and the sour smell of sweat. It was an odor that people could not forget. But what he hated most was her uneasiness when she took off her clothes and came out of the bathroom wearing only a petticoat. She put one hand high on the door, tilted her head and smiled at him. He knew that she was subconsciously smelling herself again. Such a woman. Even if he spent money on such a woman, he still couldn't be her master. 30 minutes with her was the most humbling experience. There was one more detail he couldn't forget. When she put her clothes back on, she took them off her head and put them on halfway. The clothes were piled randomly on her shoulders. As if she remembered something, she paused for a moment. For a moment he saw her in the mirror. She has a lot of fluffy yellow hair, which is tightly stretched inside her clothes, revealing a slender face. Her eyes are blue, but the blue is so blue that it goes into the halo under her eyes, and the eyes themselves become transparent glass ball. It was a cold, manly face, the face of an ancient soldier. Zhang Bao's nerves were greatly shaken. When I came out, the shadow of the tree was leaning in the shadow of the sun. This was not right. It was so wrong that it was terrifying. When it comes to whoring, you are not afraid of being obscene, casual, dirty and disgraceful. The lower the place, the more rustic it is. But it's not like this. Later, every time Zhang Bao felt that he was doing well in whoring, he would think of how stupid he was for the first time in Paris. He is now the master of the world in which he was born. From that day on, Zhang Bao made up his mind to create a right world and carry it with him everywhere. In that pocket world, he is the absolute master. Zhang Bao had lived in the UK for a long time. He ran around and found some small jobs after school. He also received subsidies for internships in factories, which made his expenses more abundant, and he also made a few girlfriends. He is a serious man, and he clearly distinguishes between serious women and prostitutes. But he is also a busy man and has limited time for dating, so he naturally prefers someone who is more relaxed. There were only a handful of Chinese women in Edinburgh. He found the two female classmates from the mainland to be reserved and pretentious, and the church was too ecclesiastical. After all, the church now is more humane, with many beautiful people dotting it. But in the past, in the 10-year-old church, the loving believers are often not very cute, and the lively ones are still a few overseas Chinese. If they are hybrids, they are more generous than overseas Chinese. Zhang Bao met a girl named Rose because it was his first love. He compared all future women to Rose. Rose's father was a decent businessman. He had been in South China for many years. Due to a temporary relationship, He married a Cantonese woman and brought her back to China. The lady is probably still there now, but she seems to be gone, unable to come out to socialize. Rose went to a British school. Just because she is not completely British, she is more British than any British. British students are a kind of cool indifference. Especially cool and indifference to the most important things. Zhang Bao couldn't tell whether Rose had fallen in love with him, but he was a little obsessed. Both of them like to go fast. On Saturday nights, they go to several dance halls. When she wasn't dancing, she always seemed absent-minded when sitting and talking. She managed to hold up a glass with a few matchsticks and asked him to help support it. Rose is like this. When she is naughty, she has a stern expression on her face. She kept a hibiscus bird at home. When the bird called to her, she finally thought that it was calling her, so she hurriedly responded, "Ah, bird." She stood on tiptoes and held hands, looking up at the bird cage. Her brown face looked like an adult because it was oblong, but she looked very childish at this time. Look at the caged bird with big eyes wide open. The whites of the eyes are blue. It's like looking into the deep blue sky. Maybe she is just an ordinary girl, but because of my youth, there is something that people cannot understand. Also like that bird, it cries like that. He didn't call anyone or anything. Her short skirt ended just above her knees, revealing a pair of light legs, as delicate as the wooden legs in a shop window, and the color of her skin was like polished and oiled wood. The hair was cut extremely short, with a small peak shaved off the back of the head. She has no hair to protect her neck and no sleeves to protect her arms. She is an open person and anyone can take advantage of her. She and Zhang Bao were casual, and Zhang Bao thought she was naive. She was casual with everyone, but Zhang Bao thought she was a bit crazy and silly. Such women may be ordinary in foreign countries, but they won't work in China. Marrying her and transplanting her into the society of her hometown would be a waste of time and money and not worthwhile. One night he drove her home. He often sent her home like this, but this time it seemed a little different. Because he was about to leave England, if he had anything to say, he should have said it a long time ago, but he didn't. Her family lives far outside the city. On the driveway late at night, the breeze and white mist gently patted my face like a fluffy powder puff. The conversation in the car was also light and fluttering, in the standard British style. With no pauses, Rose knew she had lost him. She was heated from the bottom of her heart by a desperate stubbornness. When they were almost home, she said, "Let's stop here. I don't want my family to see us saying goodbye." Zhang Bao smiled and said, "I will definitely kiss you in front of them." As soon as he put his arm around her shoulders, she pressed her face against him. And the car drove all the way, passing dozens of yards in front of her house, and then stopped. Zhang Bao put his hand under her velvet coat and hugged her through the cold rhinestones. Silver and crisp silk flowers, many exquisite and cumbersome things. Her young body seemed to pop out of her clothes. When Zhang Bao kissed her, tears streamed down her face. Neither of them could tell whether he was crying or she was crying. Outside the car window, there is still the vague wind and damp mist, which makes people use all their energy to no avail except for hugging. The rose hung tightly around his neck, always feeling something was wrong. It changed one position and then another. I didn't know how to stick it tighter. I wanted to be born in him, embedded in him. Zhang Bao was also confused. He never dreamed that Rose loved him so much. He can do whatever he wants, but this is absolutely not possible. Rose is a serious person after all. He didn't do this kind of thing. Rose's body jumped out of her clothes and onto him, but he was his own master. His self-control surprised him later. He actually hardened his heart and sent the rose home. When parting, he held her wet face, her snoring breath, tears and fluttering eyelashes. The eyelashes fluttered in his palm like a small flying insect. In the future, he would often use this incident to encourage her. I could control myself in that situation, but now I can't control myself. He was filled with wonder and admiration at his own conduct that night, but in his heart he was remorseful. He regretted betraying himself. He didn't tell many people about this, but none of his friends knew that he was Liu Xihui who was still in love. His reputation has spread. Because of his excellent grades, He had already received an offer from the British businessman Zhang Ailing and weaving factory before graduation, and he went to work as soon as he returned to Shanghai. His family lived in Jiangwan, which was too far away from the office. At first, he stayed with an acquaintance. Later, when his younger brother Tong Dubao finished junior high school, Zhen Bao managed to bring him out to make up for his studies. He had to take the exam attached to the Hongyi dyeing and weaving factory vocational school. The two of them stayed at a friend's house together, which seemed to be inconvenient. It happened that Zhen Bao had an old classmate named Wang Shihong who had returned to China 2 years earlier and was living in an apartment on Fukaisen Road. He had a spare room. Zhen Bao negotiated with him and rented it with the furniture. On the day we moved in, Zhen Bao got off work. It was already dusk when he and his brother were busy escorting the coolies to carry the boxes and cages in. Wang Shihong stood at the door with his hands on his hips and watched. A woman came out of the inner room and was washing her hair. She had a pile of soap suds on her head and made snow-white curls like a marble statue. She held her hair with both hands and said to Shihong, "Well, the porters are here. Ask them to arrange everything. It's very difficult to ask our chief clerk to help. We have to take advantage of his happiness." Wang Shihong said, "Let me introduce to you. This is Zhen Bao. This is Du Bao. And this is my wife. I haven't met her yet." The woman took her right hand out of her hair and was about to shake hands with the guests. There was soap on his hand, so it was inconvenient to stretch it out. Shan just smiled, nodded, and wiped his fingers on the towel. A little foam splashed on the back of Zhen Bao's hand. He refused to wipe it off and let it dry on its own, leaving a tightening feeling on that piece of skin, as if a mouth was gently sucking it. Mrs. Wang escaped and returned to the inner room. Zhen Bao ordered the workers to move the bed cabinets, but he was just uneasy. He always felt that there was a small mouth sucking his hand. He walked to the bathroom to wash his hands. Thinking of Mrs. Wang Shihong, I heard that she is an overseas Chinese in Singapore, and she was also a social butterfly when she was studying in London. At that time, he and Wang Shihong were getting married in London. Zhen Bao was too busy to attend the ceremony. It is better to meet than to be famous. Her face was golden brown under the white hair molded by soap. Her skin was tight and smooth, and her eyes were raised like an actress's, a striped cloth yukata, and tied tightly closed around the body. The outline of the body can be roughly guessed from the lighting strips. Every inch is alive. People in the world only say that traditional costumes with wide robes and long sleeves are not suitable for curvaceous figures, but now Zhen Bao knows that this is not true. He turned on the tap. The water was not very hot, but the boiler must be burning downstairs. There was like a hot core in the lukewarm water. A stream of water hung from the faucet, twisting and turning, and every inch was alive. Zhen Bao didn't know where he was. Wang Shihong heard him running water in the bathroom non-stop, and came over and said, "Do you want to take a bath? The water here can't be hot anymore. The hot water pipe is not installed properly. This is the problem with this apartment. If you want to wash it, you should go to our place." Zhen Bao said repeatedly, No need. "Isn't your wife washing her hair?" Shihong said. "It should be finished by now. I'll go and see it. Look." Zhen Bao said, No need. Shihong walked over to his wife and said, "I'll be fine now. You can ask Grandma to come and give him water." After a while, Shihong he called Zhen Bao to bring bath towels, soap and a change of clothes to the bathroom here. Mrs. Wang was still combing her hair in front of the mirror. The water vapor is evaporating, and because the windows are wide open, the night wind blows in, and the hair on the ground floats in clumps, like ghost shadows. Zhen Bao stood outside the door holding a towel, looking at the messy hair rolling all over the floor under the strong light in the bathroom, feeling troubled in his heart. What he likes is hot women who are a bit wild and unmarriable. The one here is already a wife and a friend's wife, so at least there is no danger. But look at her hair. She is everywhere, holding me back. Shihong and his wife were talking in the bathroom and couldn't hear clearly. After filling a basin with water, the two came out and asked Zhen Bao to go in and take a bath. After Zhen Bao finished taking a bath, he squatted down and picked up the messy hair on the tiles. gathering them into a pile. The hair that has been permed is yellow at the tips and is quite hard, like a thin steel wire that carries electricity. He stuffed it into his trouser pocket. His hands stayed in the pocket, feeling hot all over. Such behavior is too ridiculous after all. He took out the ball of hair again and gently threw it into the spittoon. He returned to his room with a soapy towel, and his brother Du Bao was unpacking things and saying to him, "I don't know what kind of people the previous tenants here were. You see, on the chair covers and carpets, it's all cigarette holes. Look at the water stains on the table. They can't be wiped off. Will Mr. Wang blame us in the future?" Zhang Bao said, "Of course not. They know it themselves. And we have been together for many years." "Old classmate, who is as stingy as you?" Yin laughed. Du Bao pondered for a moment and then asked, "Do you know the former tenant?" Zhang Bao said, "It seems that his surname is Sun. He also came back from the United States and taught in a university." "What did you ask him to do?" Du Bao smiled before he spoke and said, "You weren't here just now. Their chief clerk and grandma came in to hang the curtains for us. I heard them muttering something like, 'I don't know if I'll stay long or not,' and said that Mr. Wang must drive him away. Originally, Mr. Wang was going to Singapore to do business, and he should have left long ago because of this incident. He was worried that he had to leave, so he left. The two of them fought for 2 months. Zhang Bao hurriedly shouted, "You believe their nonsense? When you live in someone else's house, first of all, you can't talk about your employer with their servants. This is a big mistake." Du Bao is speechless. After a while, Grandma came in to invite her to dinner, and Brother Zhang Bao came out together. The Wang family's food has a bit of Nanyang flavor, with Chinese and Western dishes. The main one being mutton curry. Mrs. Wang herself had only a thin slice of toast and a slice of ham in front of her. She also cut off the fat part and gave it to her husband. Zhang Bao laughed and said, "Why does Mrs. Wang have such a small appetite?" Shi Hong said, "She is afraid of getting fat." Zhang Bao looked surprised and said, "Mrs. Wang is just right. She is not fat at all." Mrs. Wang said, "I have recently lost 5 pounds. I am much thinner." Shi Hong smiled and stretched out his hand to pinch her cheek and said, "A lot thinner? What is this?" His wife glanced at him and said, "This is me. The mutton we ate last year." After saying this, everyone laughed. It was the first time that Brother Zhang Bao met her. As the host, she did not change her clothes and go to the table to eat. She was still wearing the same bathrobe just now. The hair on her head was not completely dry. She had a white towel wrapped around it, and water dripped from under it. Glitters adorned the center of the eyebrows. Her level of informality was not only surprising to Du Bao, who had always been in the countryside. Even Zhang Bao found it strange. She asked questions at the banquet and was very considerate. Although it was obvious that she was not good at managing the family, she was good at socializing. Shi Hong said to Zhang Bao, "I didn't have time to tell you a while ago that I am going out tomorrow and have to go to Singapore for something. Fortunately, you have moved in now. Everything is taken care of." Zhang Bao smiled. He said, "Mrs. Wang is such a capable person. She can take care of us just fine. How can it be our turn to take care of her?" Shi Hong said with a smile, "Don't look at her chattering. She doesn't understand anything. When she comes to China, I've been here for 3 years, but I still can't get used to it. And I can't even talk." Mrs. Wang smiled and didn't argue with him. She called her mother to get the bottle of medicine from the cupboard, poured out a spoonful and ate it. When Zhang Bao saw the thick white paint-like juice in the spoon, he frowned and said, "Is this calcium milk? I've eaten it too, and it tastes terrible." Mrs. Wang drank a spoonful and was speechless for a while, swallowed his saliva, and said, "It's like drinking from a wall." Zhang Bao laughed again and said, "Mrs. Wang speaks one sentence after another, so powerful." Mrs. Wang said, "Mr. Tong, don't call me Mrs. Wang all the time." After saying that, she stood up and walked to a desk by the window. Zhang Bao thought for a while and said, "It is true that the word Mrs. Wang seems to be too lacking in personality." Mrs. Wang was sitting at the desk, as if writing something there. Shi Hong followed her and put his hand on her shoulder. He went up, bent down and asked, "What medicine should I take if I feel well?" Mrs. Wang just wrote, without looking back, and replied, I'm getting angry. And I have a pimple on my face. Shi Hong put his face close and said, Where? Mrs. Wang gently stepped aside, frowned and smiled again, and said warningly, Hey, Du Bao grew up in the old family and had never seen such a couple before. Unable to sit still, I just watched the scenery, opened the glass door, and walked to the balcony. Chen Bao peeled his apple quite calmly. Mrs. Wang came over again, handed him a piece of paper, and said with a smile, Hey, I have a name too, Shi Hong said with a smile. It's okay if you don't show the Chinese characters in your hand. Call them just kidding. Zhen Bao took a look and saw the 3 characters Wang Jiarui written crookedly on the paper. The characters got bigger and bigger, and the word Rui was scattered here and there. It simply became 3 characters, and he smiled unconsciously. Shi Hong clapped his hands and said, I said people would laugh at you. You overseas Chinese are really not generous enough to mention your names. Jiarui pursed her lips, grabbed the piece of paper, rolled it into a ball, and turned around to leave, as if she was angry. However, less than half a minute after she left, she came back in, holding an open glass bottle with candied walnuts in her hand. She started eating it as she walked, and asked Zhen Bao Du Bao to eat it. Shi Hong said with a smile, We are not afraid of getting fat anymore. Zhen Bao said with a smile, It's true, eating too much sugar makes you most likely to gain weight. Shi Hong said with a smile, You don't know that the overseas Chinese, Kai said halfway through. Jiarui hit her and said, It's those overseas Chinese again. You're not allowed to call me them. Shi Hong continued, They are overseas Chinese. Chinese people also have their disadvantages, and foreigners also have their disadvantages. I have learned from foreigners to be afraid of getting fat. I won't eat this or that. And I always take laxatives. I still have to eat sugar. Ask her. If you ask her why she eats this, she must have said that she has been a little short for the past 2 days. For coughs, rock candy walnuts are the most effective in curing coughs. Zhen Bao said with a smile. Indeed, this is the old temper of the Chinese people. Whatever they like to eat is the most effective. Jiarui picked up a walnut kernel and placed it between her upper and lower teeth. She pointed her little finger at him and said, Don't say that. There is some truth to this. Section 2 in front of her. Zhen Bao always seemed to be drunk and afraid of losing his etiquette. So he started chatting with her and walked to the balcony. As the cold wind blew, I became more and more suspicious of whether my head and face were a little red just now. He was really troubled. So he said goodbye to Rose forever. She came back to life and became his wife. Moreover, this woman is more advanced than Rose. In her room, it is as if the room is filled with vermilion murals, with half-naked paintings of her on the left and right. How could I meet this kind of woman? Is it his own fault? He is always on the verge of breaking out? Don't give up. There are very few people in this category among pure Chinese people. Because he had just returned to China, he was mixed up in a half-Western and half-Chinese social circle. When you are in a foreign country, whenever you meet a Chinese, it is like meeting an old friend in a foreign land. Meeting old acquaintances from a foreign land again in their hometown, they became familiar once and rekindled each other, and gradually became alienated. But this Wang Jiarui, wouldn't Shi Hong have done well by marrying her? Of course, Wang Shi Hong, I am rich and it is not like him to move forward entirely on his own. Such a woman is a drag. Besides, he is not as good-tempered as Wang Shi Hong, who allows women to misbehave. It wouldn't be a big deal if he and she were noisy all day long. It would wear down a man's ambition. Of course, it was also because Wang Shi Hong couldn't control her. Otherwise, she would be like this. Zhen Bao folded his arms and leaned on the railing. Downstairs, a brightly lit tram stopped at the door. Many people got on and off, and the lights on the car drove away again. The street was quiet except for the lights of the beef farm below the apartment building. The wind blew to fallen leaves, and they walked on by themselves as if they were worn-out shoes. There are so many people in this world, but they can't accompany you home in the dead of night, and no matter when, as long as it is a matter of life and death, in a deep dark place. At that time, you can only have a wife you truly love, or you will be lonely. Zhen Bao did not think clearly like this. He only felt a sense of sadness. Shihong and his wife talked all the way and walked to the balcony. Shihong asked his wife, "Is your hair dry? The wind blows and you have to cough even more." Jiarui took off the towel on her head, shook her hair and said, "It doesn't matter." Zhenbao guessed that they were about to part ways. Thinking that he must have something to say, he deliberately held his mouth and yawned and said, "Let's go to bed first. Dubao will have to get up early to get the charter from school tomorrow." Shihong said, "I'll go to bed tomorrow. You'll leave in the afternoon and I probably won't see you again." The two shook hands and said goodbye. Then Zhenbao went back to his room. The next day Zhenbao came back from get off work and rang the bell. Jiarui held the phone receiver in one hand and opened the door for him. The light in the hall was very dark, and I couldn't see clearly, but I saw that Shihong's hat and coat were missing from the clothes rack. And the suitcase placed under the clothes rack was also missing. I thought he had already left. Zhenbao took off his coat and hung it on the rack. He heard Jiarui dial the phone number and said, "Mr. Sun, please answer the phone." Zhenbao was concerned. Hear Jiarui ask again, "Is it Timmy?" "No, I'm not going out today. I'm waiting for a boyfriend at home." As she said that, she started to giggle and said, "Who is he?" "I won't tell you." "Why should I tell you?" "Oh, aren't you interested? Aren't you interested in yourself?" "Anyway, I'm waiting for him to have tea at 5 o'clock. Just waiting for him. So don't come in here." Zhenbao didn't wait for her to finish speaking and went into the house long ago. His brother was not in the house, and there was no one in the bathroom. He went to the balcony, but Jiarui came out from the living room and said, "Dubao dropped his words and asked me to tell you that he went out to look at some books that he might buy at a used bookstall." Zhenbao thanked her. He glanced at her. The floor-length robe he wore was the hottest, moistest green, and it turned green whenever it touched anything. She moved slightly, as if there was a green mark on the air she had just occupied. The dress seemed to be too small, with 1.5 inch slits opening on both sides, and crisscrossed with green ribbons, revealing the dark pink petticoat underneath. Those overly dazzling colors will make people suffer from color blindness if they look at them for a long time. Only she could wear such clothes, as if nothing had happened. She said, "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" As she said this, she turned around and walked to the living room, sat down at the table, and poured tea from the teapot. There were 2 cups and plates neatly placed on the table. There were butter biscuits and toasted bread on the plate. Zhenbao stood at the glass door and smiled and said, "Are there any guests coming later?" Jiarui said, "Let's not wait for him. Let's eat first." Zhenbao hesitated for a while, still unable to figure out what she meant. "Let's sit down with her." Jiarui asked, "Do you want milk?" Zhenbao said, "I'm free to do it." Jiarui said, "Oh, by the way, you like to drink tea. Over the years in foreign countries, you have always wanted to have nothing to eat. Yesterday you said it." Zhenbao said with a smile, "You have a really good memory." Jiarui stood up and rang the bell, glanced at him slightly and said, "You don't know, usually I have the worst memory." Zhenbao's heart was pounding, jumping. I couldn't help but feel a little dazed. When Grandma came in, Jiarui ordered, "Make 2 cups of tea." Zhenbao smiled and said, "By the way, ask her to bring a cup and a plate. We will have to add more when the guests come." Jiarui looked at her. She gave him a look and smiled. "What kind of guest do you think about him like this?" "Mom, bring me a pen and a piece of paper." She wrote a note quickly and pushed it over for Zhenbao to read. It was a very simple 2 sentences. "Dear Timmy, I'm very sorry today. I have something to do and I have to go out." Jiarui, she folded the piece of paper in half, handed it to her mother and said, "Mr. Sun will be here later. If you give this to him, just say I'm not at home." Auntie went out. Zhenbao ate biscuits and said with a smile, "I really don't understand you. Why bother to come? I made an appointment and asked someone to come all the way." Jiarui leaned forward and concentrated on thinking, looking at the assorted biscuits on the plate. She couldn't find any that she liked, so she replied, "When I asked him out, I didn't intend for him to run away in vain." Zhenbao said, "Oh, was it a temporary decision?" Jiarui smiled, said, "Haven't you heard this sentence? Women have the right to change their opinions. Grandma brought green tea, and the tea leaves were floating on the water. Zhen Bao held the glass in both hands, but he couldn't drink it. He looked at the tea and thought of a reason in his mind. Jia Rui was connected to the man named Sun behind her husband's back, and she clearly felt that he was an eyesore, so she deliberately showed her affection to him today, hung up his hand, and blocked his mouth. In fact, Zhen Bao definitely didn't have the heart to meddle in their business. Not to mention that he and Shi Hong were not close friends, and even if they were friends who cut off their heads and replaced their necks, it would be unreasonable to sow discord between other couples. But no matter what, this woman is not easy to mess with. He became a little more wary. Jia Rui put down the teacup, stood up, took out a jar of peanut butter from the cupboard, and said with a smile, "I'm a rough person and like to eat rough things." Zhen Bao said with a smile, "Oh, this thing is the most nutritious and the most nutritious. It makes people fat." Jia Rui opened the lid and said, "I really like breaking the law. Don't you agree with breaking the law?" Zhen Bao pressed his hand on a glass jar and said, "No." Jia Rui hesitated for a long time and said with a smile, "This way, come on, please give me a little bread. You won't give me too much." Seeing her looking so young and pitiful, Zhen Bao couldn't help laughing, and he actually put some peanut butter on her bread. Jia Rui stared at him from the rim of the teacup, pursed her lips and said with a smile, "Do you know why I ordered you? If it were me, maybe my willpower would suddenly become strong, and it would be too weak." They both laughed together. Unable to resist her childish charm, Zhen Bao gradually softened. While he was drinking tea, the doorbell rang outside. Zhen Bao was a little uneasy and said repeatedly, "Is this the guest you invited? Don't you think it's dissatisfying?" Jia Rui just shrugged. Zhen Bao walked to the balcony holding the glass and said, "When he comes out, I'd like to see what kind of person he is." Jia Rui then followed and said, He's very beautiful. So beautiful." Zhen Bao leaned against the railing and said with a smile, "You don't like handsome men?" Jia Rui said, "Men are extremely beautiful, and men are even more difficult to tolerate than women." Zhen Bao looked at her with half-closed eyes and smiled. "Don't speaking of others, you yourself have been spoiled." Jia Rui said, "Maybe. You are just the opposite. You deprive yourself of everything, but in fact you are a fun-loving and delicious person like me." Zhen Bao laughed and said, "Oh really? You know it." Jia Rui lowered her head and gently picked up the tea leaves in the cup. She took a long time and took a sip. Zhen Bao also ate the tea silently. Not long after, a man in a suit walked out of the apartment and looked down from the third floor. I couldn't see clearly, but I saw that he turned a corner hastily, as if he was holding back his breath. Zhen Bao couldn't help but said again, "Poor. It was a waste of time." Jia Rui said, "Anyway, he has nothing to do all day long. I am also a person who has nothing to do, but I look down on people who have nothing to do. I just like to snatch a little time from busy people like a wolf. Do you think this is cheap?" Zhen Bao leaned on the railing, first kicked it with one foot, and gradually kicked up her wicker chair intentionally or unintentionally. When the chair vibrated, the flesh on her arms trembled slightly. She didn't have much flesh. Just because her frame is small, she looks a little fatter. Zhen Bao knew. "Do you like busy people?" Jia Rui put a hand on her eyes and said with a smile, "It doesn't matter actually. My heart is an apartment." Zhen Bao said with a smile, "Well, is it possible? Where are the empty rooms for rent?" Jia Rui refused. Zhen Bao said, "But I can't live in an apartment. I want to live in a single building." Jia Rui snorted and said, "See if you have the ability to tear down the heavy building." Zhen Bao kicked her chair hard again. "Look at me." Jia Rui took her hand away from her face, looked at him with wide eyes and said, "You can also say a few witty words." Zhen Bao said with a smile, "I saw you. It's not like you are clever, so playful." Jia Rui said, "Seriously, tell me something about your past." Zhen Bao said, "What's the matter?" Jia Rui swept one leg over and kicked him so hard that he almost spilled the tea in his hand. She smiled and said, "Pretend." "I already know it," Zhen Bao said. "You know and you still ask. You should tell me your story," Jia Rui said. Me. She tilted her head. He put his chin on his shoulders, and after a while, he said in a low voice, "My whole life can be described in a few words." After a long while, Zhang Bao urged, "Then, just say it," Jia Rui said. But he remained silent, thinking intently. Zhang Bao asked, "How did you and Shihong meet?" Jia Rui said, "It's very common. The student union meets in London. I am the representative and he is also the representative." Zhang Bao said, "Are you at the University of London?" Jia Rui said, "My family sent me to England to study, just to get married and choose a good one. I was young when I went there, and I didn't want to get married at all, but I was just hanging out in the name of finding someone. It was fun." Over the past few years, her reputation has gradually declined, so she hurriedly caught Shihong. Zhang Bao kicked her chair. "You haven't had enough," Jia Rui said. "It's not a question of whether you have enough. One person, when you learn something, you can't bear to put it away." Zhang Bao smiled and said, "Don't forget you are in China." Jia Rui drank the remaining tea in one gulp, stood up, and spat the tea leaves into her mouth. He went outside and said with a smile, "China also has China's freedom. You can vomit on the street as you like." The doorbell rang again. Zhang Bao guessed that it was his brother who had returned, and it turned out to be Du Bao. As soon as Du Bao came back, things were naturally different. After Zhang Bao passed by, he thought carefully about what had just happened. On the balcony at dusk, he couldn't see her carefully and could only hear the low voice, secretly, like a tickling sound under the ears. In the darkness, the existence of her moving body can be temporarily forgotten. So there is a chance to know that there is something else about her. She seems to be a smart and straightforward person. Although she is a wife, she is still mentally underdeveloped. This is what Zhang Bao thinks is the most endearing thing about her. It was here that he felt a new threat. Compared with this new threat, the mere temptation of meat was nothing. He absolutely cannot be serious. That's asking for trouble. Maybe it was her body that was causing trouble. When a man longs for a woman's body, he cares about her soul and lies to himself that he is in love with her soul. Only after occupying her body could he forget her soul. Maybe this is the only way out. Why not? She has many lovers, one more and one less, and she doesn't care. Although Wang Shihong cannot be said not to care, he does not suffer any greater injustice. Chen Bao suddenly reminded himself that he was trying to think of all kinds of reasons why he should sleep with this woman. He felt ashamed and decided to try to avoid her from now on. At the same time, he started looking for a house and moved as soon as a suitable place became available. He asked someone to make arrangements and placed his younger brother in a boarding dormitory in a vocational school, leaving him alone, which would be easier. He originally had lunch at a restaurant near the office, but now he also eats dinner out. He doesn't go home until very late and goes to bed as soon as he returns. One night I heard the phone ringing, but no one answered it for a long time. As soon as he ran out, he seemed to hear Jia Rui's door opening. He was afraid that they would bump into each other in the dark corridor, so he planned to retreat. But Jia Rui seemed to be unable to reach the phone in a hurry, so he approached and turned on the light. When I saw Wang Jiarui under the light, I was stunned by him. She didn't know. But she had just taken a shower and put on a set of pajamas. They were jackets and trousers made of strong cloth commonly worn by overseas Chinese in Nanyang. The flowers printed on the sarong cloth were so black that it was unclear whether they were dragons, snakes or plants. Vine, orange and green blooming inside the black gold. It made the night inside the room darker. In the dim yellow light, this hall looks like a train, traveling from a foreign land to a foreign land. The woman on the train met by chance, but she was an amiable woman. She picked up the receiver with one hand and reached down to her ribs with the other hand to button the small golden walnut button. She buttoned it for a while, but it didn't close. In fact, she couldn't see anything inside. Zhen Bao couldn't help but feel anxious. Guan Kang, she stood twisted around, her hair splayed down sideways, her complexion as yellow as a golden idol, her eyelashes lowered, and the shadow of the eyelashes was as heavy as a small hand clasped on her cheek. I was walking in a hurry just now, and I kicked off one of my leather slippers. and my shoeless foot stepped on the instep of the other one. Zhenbo only had time to see the traces of prickly heat powder on her ankles. She had already hung up the phone. She had dialed the wrong number. Jiarui could not stand firmly, so she slumped over and sat down on the chair, holding her hand back. Press the phone. Zhenbao put his hand on the doorknob to express that he would not talk much. He nodded to her and said with a smile, "Why haven't I seen you all these times? I thought you melted like candy." He clearly knew that he was hiding. It is also a kind of self-defense to look at her instead of hiding from him. Before she can speak, he speaks first. Boring, he knew, but when he saw her he couldn't help but joke. There was that kind of woman. Jiarui chuckled. She still couldn't find her shoe, and Zhenbao couldn't see through it. When he came over, he bent down to bring it to her, but she had already slipped in. He felt embarrassed again, and asked a little bit angrily for no reason, "Where are all your servants today?" Jiarui said. The chief minister and his grandmother came to the same village, to accompany the fellow villagers to play in the big world. Went, Zhenbao said. Oh. Then he smiled and said, "Aren't you afraid of being alone at home?" Jiarui stood up and walked to the room, smiling. "What are you afraid of?" Zhenbao laughed. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Jiarui said with a smile without looking back. "What? I'm not afraid of being alone with a gentleman." At this time, Zhenbao leaned his vest against the doorknob again, leaned back, as if he didn't want to leave. He said, "I don't pretend to be a gentleman." Jiarui smiled and said, "A real gentleman doesn't need to dress up." She had already opened the door and entered, then leaned over and flicked off the light in the corridor. Zhenbao was shocked in the darkness, but his excitement was in vain. She was no longer there. Zhenbao tossed and turned all night long and told himself that it didn't matter. Jiarui was different from Rose. A willful married woman was the freest woman. He didn't have to take any responsibility for her, but he couldn't help but take responsibility for himself. When he thinks of roses, he thinks of how aboveboard he behaved in the car in the field that night. He couldn't be sorry for who he was back then.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.